Welcome to the deep dive. So you've handed us a pretty substantial stack of academic material. This time we're taking a journey through a particular slice of the MIT Encyclopedia of the Cognitive Sciences, focusing on, well, the O entries.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're not just going to define these terms. We want to map out how these highly specialized concepts, everything from vision to language theory, how they all connect and reveal the underlying machinery of cognition.
Yeah, it's like a shortcut to getting up to speed on some really distinct domains.
Exactly. Neuroscience, AI, linguistics, psychology, it's all in here.
And what immediately jumps out, at least to me, is the contrast. This section is sort of split between two worlds. On one hand, you have the mechanisms for dealing with physical space, how the brain manages things like object recognition.
Motor control, like oculomotor control.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, you have this completely separate abstract world of formal rules for language, captured by optimality theory. It's a real study in complexity, biological versus, well, formal. Okay, let's unpack this, and I think we have to start with how our brains just make sense of the visual world.
So object recognition, and specifically as studied in animal models, right? Primates.
Right. And the foundational hurdle here, the really big problem the visual system has to solve, is what we call invariance.
Invariance.
Yeah, think about that coffee mug on your desk. It's the same object whether you see it up close, far away, in bright sunlight, or, rotated 90 degrees. But for your retina, it produces a totally different pattern of light every single time.
Okay, right.
So the core problem is, how does the brain build a stable, constant representation of that mug that is, well, invariant to how you're looking at it?
And why is that so critical? I mean, why can't the brain just, process every single view it sees as a new thing?
Well, if the output from the visual system wasn't constant, if every little change in lighting or angle created a brand new object, the systems that come after, like memory and emotion, they would just collapse.
The hippocampus, the amygdala, they would be forced to memorize every single viewing angle for every object they've ever seen. Invariance is basically the filtration system that makes generalization and memory possible at all.
So the neuroscience, it points to a specific area in the brain that's doing all this heavy lifting.
It does. Studies in macaque monkeys have shown that the inferior temporal visual cortex, we just call it IT, is centrally involved. If you have damage to the IT cortex, you see serious trouble when objects are shown at different sizes or under different lighting.
So we have evidence of specialized neurons that are actually doing this view invariant encoding.
We do. Within a subregion of IT called area TE, you find these specific neurons that respond only to a subset of objects, but, and this is the key, they fire just as strongly regardless of the position or angle of that object.
So they successfully stripped away all the noise.
All the noise are just communicating one thing: this is the mug.
But how does the system stay efficient? I mean, you can't have one neuron for every single object you've ever encountered. That seems impossible.
That's the beautiful efficiency hack the brain developed. It's called sparsely distributed encoding. Instead of a one-to-one map, each neuron responds to a subset of objects, maybe faces, or certain kinds of shapes, or specific textures.
So it's almost like, if I think about a phone number, you only have 10 digits, 0 through 9. But with those 10 buttons, you can create millions and millions of unique combinations.
That's a perfect analogy. It captures that exponential advantage. The amount of information you get only increases linearly as you add more neurons. But the number of unique things you can represent grows exponentially. It's what makes the whole system work.
This whole problem of invariance, it led to a bit of a split in early cognitive modeling. You had one approach from David Marr suggesting the system stores these precise 3D coordinates.
Like a kind of syntactical description.
Yeah, body connected to thigh connected to shin, that kind of thing. And then it uses general math to transform the coordinates when the view changes.
But the biological implementation of that is just incredibly complex. Trying to represent a grammatical description of an object in the actual wiring of neurons is very difficult.
So what's the more biologically plausible alternative then?
It's simpler, actually. The idea is you store a few associated 2D views, but the brain has to learn which views belong to the same object, and that's where the visual system's hierarchical processing comes in.
Okay.
Information flows from V1 up to V2, D4, and through TEO to TE, and at each of those stages, the receptive fields of the neurons, the little patch of the world they're looking at, they get bigger by about 2.5 times.
So as the information moves up the chain, the representation becomes less about where it is and more about what it is.
Precisely.
So how does the system learn that an object that's moving slightly is still the same object?
Through competitive learning, it's a type of self-organizing network. The key is a really short temporal window for what we call Hebb modifiability. It's only about half a second.
And Hebbian learning is the whole neurons that fire together, wire together idea.
Exactly, and that timing is absolutely crucial.
Fine.
Because when a real object moves in the world, the image shifts across your retina, but that shift usually happens within that half-second window. The neuron that fired first stays active just long enough for the inputs from the new retinal position to also strengthen their connection to that very same neuron. The system learns the statistical regularity, the continuity, and figures out that all these different views belong to the same invariant object.
That is powerful, using time and competition to learn what's continuous. Okay, let's transition from animal models to how we understand this in humans' object recognition in human neuropsychology. And this is mostly through studying agnosia.
Right, the failure to recognize objects after some kind of brain damage. And the historical cornerstone here is still Lissauer's distinction between two core types of agnosia.
The first one being apperceptive agnosia.
Yes, this is where the patient's problem is really a failure of perception itself. They just can't build a coherent whole percept from what they're seeing. Maybe the visual grouping is broken?
And the second type, which is maybe even more perplexing, is associative agnosia.
With associative agnosia, perception seems to be totally intact. The patient can see shapes, they can see features, but they just can't link that percept to its meaning or function.
There's that classic example of the patient who sees a stethoscope.
Right, and describes it perfectly. A long coil with a round thing at the end, but has absolutely no idea that it's a medical instrument. They can copy a drawing line by line, which shows their low-level vision is fine, but they can't name the object. The connection to the high-level semantic knowledge is just severed.
And that gap tells us something about where those high-level representations are stored.
It does, usually in the inferior temporal-occipital cortex.
But we get the deepest insights from the really selective deficits, right?
Yeah.
The cases that show the system is organized into specialized parts, like prosopagnosia.
Which is face blindness, essentially. The failure is confined to, or at least much worse for, face recognition. The evidence for face specialization is just so robust. We have cases of patients who literally mistake their own reflection for a stranger.
Wow.
And studies where they can recognize individual sheep faces better than human faces. It's not just about complexity. Faces seem to be processed differently.
And then there's the flip side, pure alexia.
Pure alexia is an impairment in reading. It's slow, often painfully letter by letter, but object and face recognition are fine. And while it looks like a reading disorder, it's really a visual recognition problem affecting the rapid processing of multiple shapes at once.
And letters are just tiny clustered shapes.
Exactly. Language demands that we process tons of them very fast.
And the critical evidence for this separation is the double dissociation.
Right. We have cases of agnosia without alexia-impaired objects, reading, and cases of pure alexia-impaired reading, object.
Which is mirrored by the brain localization.
Yes, the dual systems hypothesis suggests face-specific issues often come from bilateral damage, so damage on both sides of the brain, while word-specific impairment, like alexia, often comes from unilateral damage, typically on the left side.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on how visual information gets in. Now let's shift to how we direct our vision, the output. Oculomotor control. This is where high-level vision meets pure biomechanics.
And the classification of eye movements is all based on their purpose. You have gaze-stabilization systems, like the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which uses your inner ear to counteract head movement.
Then you have the gaze-aligning movements, which are more deliberate, the super-fast saccades, which can hit 1,000 degrees per second.
And smooth pursuit, for tracking something moving.
Yeah.
Finally, you have vergence movements for focusing at different distances.
So here's the computational challenge. All 6 of the eye muscles are controlled by just 3 nuclei in the brainstem, the so-called final common path. To move the eye, the motor neurons have to generate 2 very different forces.
Right. First, there's a pulsatile burst of activity. That's what regulates the velocity and gets the eye moving to the right spot.
And then they also need a long-lasting increment or decrement, a steady holding force, sometimes called the step, to keep the eye still in its new position.
And this is where the neural integration comes in, and it's brilliant.
It's like, if I'm driving, the pulse is me hitting the accelerator to get up to speed. But the step is like setting the cruise control to hold it there.
Exactly. The brainstem has to take that initial velocity signal, the pulse, and mathematically integrate it over time to compute the exact holding force required. That happens in circuits involving the nucleus prepositus hypoglossi. It's an internal calculation.
If I accelerate this much for this long, I need this much force to hold it steady.
That's the one.
And the high-level commands for the Saccades, the rapid jumps, they originate in two main places: the superior colliculus in the midbrain and the frontal eye fields up in the neocortex.
And both of these structures use this highly organized topographic map-like system to encode the direction and the amplitude of the movement. They're the navigators, and we know they're absolutely critical because if you remove both of them, saccades are permanently gone. The system can't tell the eyes where to jump anymore.
Okay, so we've covered visual invariance and the mechanical necessity of neural integration.
Mm-hmm.
We've been deep in the biological hardware. Let's make that pivot now to the abstract world of language and how it manages conflict through rules. We're talking about optimality theory, or OT.
Yes, and OT is a really powerful framework for thinking about universal grammar. It basically says that all languages are trying to achieve the same goals, but those goals often conflict with each other.
And the core mechanism that resolves this conflict, and this is what defines the difference between all the world's languages, is constraint ranking.
That's right. The theory says all human languages share the exact same set of universal constraints. The grammar of any specific language is determined only by how it prioritizes or ranks those constraints. What's a top priority in English might be a low priority in Italian.
So this means that the constraints are always minimally viable. You have to obey them, unless they conflict with a constraint that's ranked higher in your language's hierarchy.
Let's use that classic example. Subject omission. English says it rains, but Italian just says piove rains.
Okay, so the conflict there is between two constraints. One is subject, which says every sentence has to have a subject, and the other is FULL-INT, which says every part of the sentence has to have meaning.
Exactly. English resolves this conflict by putting structure first. The subject constraint outranks FULL-INT. It's more important to have a subject than for everything to be meaningful, so we tolerate the meaningless placeholder it.
But Italian flips the ranking.
They flip it. For them, FULL-INT outranks subject. They prioritize meaning, so they ban the meaningless subject and just violate the structural rule instead. The only difference is that simple vertical ordering of two universal rules.
And that's really powerful for syntactic theory because you don't have to invent these invisible structures to make the rules work anymore.
Precisely. It also applies to phonology through the concept of competition. A given structure is grammatical if it's more harmonic, meaning it has fewer or less serious violations than any of the alternatives.
And this is where faithfulness constraints come in.
Right, which just demand that the output should match the input as closely as possible. But sometimes, even faithfulness has to be violated. Think about the past tense marker D. A higher-ranked rule about syllable structure might force you to insert a vowel, like embedded, just to make the word pronounceable. It's all a series of trade-offs.
Before we wrap, just a quick note on the other O entries. Olfaction points you to the entry on smell, and ontology sends you toward knowledge representation and conceptual structures.
You know, if we look back at the big picture of this whole section, the most compelling takeaway for me is the role of conflict management in cognition, no matter what domain you're in.
That's a great point. We saw the brain solve conflict with hierarchical learning to get visual invariance.
And we saw the brainstem solve a mechanical conflict with mathematical integration to control our gaze.
And then we saw language solve abstract structural conflict through this system of universal constraint ranking.
This idea of finding the most optimal solution, the one that's least penalized by managing all these competing demands, it really seems to be a fundamental feature of our cognitive architecture.
Absolutely. Which leads to a final thought. Given that both vision and language rely on systems that manage conflict, one through biological learning, the other through formal rules, does this pattern suggest that constraint management in all its different forms might be the single overarching principle of how the brain operates? Something to mull over.
A very interesting question.
Thank you for sharing your sources with us for this deep dive. We hope this has been your shortcut to being well informed.